Right, let's get started. I do apologize for missing yesterday's, and I will make up for it eventually, but let's actually talk about some things. I'm sure I've probably addressed the basic idea previously, but it is worth understanding when it comes to the state how important long term thinking is. See, planning for states often requires the weighing of suffering among people and specific groups, along with animals to a lesser extent. For example, let's say a state has a choice between starving half of its population or a quarter based on the fact that it's suffering a famine and can't import enough food with the money it has. The state will naturally have to make a choice on who suffers and how much suffering is allowed. That is just a reality that people just have to accept. You may not like it, but the reality is that is the position the state can easily find itself in. And so states not acting in the long term will almost always see themselves leading to the suffering of others, because they're not weighing their options properly. Instead of saying, okay, what leads to the best long term benefits for the most people, they're instead saying, let's think about the short term enjoyment, often wasting resources that are desperately going to be needed later on. And so you have a situation where, naturally speaking, those who prioritize the long term will find themselves further ahead than those who don't. Let's use a real life example, Social Security, right? It was initially set up as a short term measure and function, because if you think about it, Social Security had a few years of taxation put into it, and then it was activated. It wasn't a generation, it wasn't waiting until the people paying in retired so that they could receive the benefits of their own money. It was people who didn't put into the system receiving money because the state deemed it best, especially during the Great Depression. That was a short term thought with a plan that was not made with long term interests in mind. You see, it was set up in such a way that should the age increase over time, the average age, and mortality decrease without a raise in population growth, then naturally what's going to happen is the population is going to get older and then it will struggle. But the state was not made with that in mind. Or rather, it didn't make the program with that in mind. And so you have a situation where if population growth continues to stagnate and the age of the population on average continues to go up, then what we'll see naturally is essentially a 1-to-1 requirement of person paying in and person receiving. And that isn't good for the people. It isn't good for the sustainability of such an institution. And so naturally, Social Security is not something that can last. A short-term institution cannot sustain itself in the long term. So, any consideration must be based in the long-term interests of the state and its people. You must think, okay, let's assume this is true. What do we know about this, and how can we apply it to our long-term interests? For example, let's assume that taxation will be at 30%, let's say, for the foreseeable future, right? Well, then we're going to have to think, what are we going to do with that 30% of taxation? How are we going to use it to further the state and its interests? We could drop it over time as budgets allow and allow for a gradual decline to increase the population's access to its own wealth, or we could invest it in certain things that will presumably see a long-term payout. That is long-term thinking. We have this, we know this, how do we make a decision that will help the generations that come after? This is far more difficult in elected governments because people are very short-sighted, especially when it comes to not their own, but others' money. If you, for example, give a person $100 and basically say, buy whatever you want with it, they are going to buy something that isn't necessarily the best, but is enjoyable for them. That's essentially what's going on with the state. People give it money, and it spends them as it deems necessary. Naturally speaking, the state is not thinking in terms of its own money because, well, it doesn't make any money naturally. It's spending the money it collects from other people as a levy to do its own thing. So it's basically that situation of giving $100 taken to the extreme, because there is no guarantee in the case of the $100 that you're going to see that 100 come back again. There is, though, a guarantee with the state, given its tendency for force, that it will receive its tax revenue again even if it costs a few people a few prison sentences. And so, for elected governments, the people must first be taught what works and what doesn't, followed by effectively bullying their representatives to carry out those effective actions. And I say bullying not to be rude, but rather a continuous pressuring of them, basically a bully pulpit. If you know Theodore Roosevelt, you know what I'm implying there, to the representative saying, do what is best, or we will get you the freak out. Now, people naturally, of course, are still very short-sighted when it comes to the state, especially when it comes to the fact that they may well be one of the people who are receiving such benefits from the state. Even if they are short-term benefits, excuse me. Even if they are short-term benefits, people are still going to think, well, I would like that to keep going, so I want it to still go. And so I'm going to vote for the short-term measure, even though that's not beneficial in the long term. It's not smart, but it is what people do, because people are self-interested, and plenty are very short-sighted, especially when they don't think it's their money being spent. And so, while difficult, people must be brought into the light and understand what's best in the long term is best for you. That is the big thing, and that is the big hurdle to overcome. Difficult, yes. Would I argue it's possible to at least convince a majority? I would say, yeah, it's possible, if extremely difficult. And so, given this long-term focus, austerity, Spartan levels of possessions, and other sacrifices are likely to be needed in the short term in order to allow for long-term prosperity and the luxury of indulgence. Essentially, you often have to restrain your purse strings to be able to afford something in the long term, to allow for that prosperity to emerge, cut short crises, and allow for someone to have the privilege of indulgence. Because remember, things like this are a privilege. The idea that I can have this from my university is a privilege. The idea that someone can go to a city, visit for a few days, enjoy the local people and the sites is a privilege. That is not something guaranteed. It is not your right to go to another city, take some pictures, and then come back. Indulgence, the ability to enjoy excess, is a luxury. It's a privilege that it can only be afforded when you have the wealth to do so, and oftentimes with a state, if you take that principle and apply it to them, it really doesn't look too good. If a single person does a few short-term things, like say, taking a vacation when they don't have much saved up, deciding to switch jobs despite not having some money saved up for the transition, all those short-sighted things that people tend to do without fully thinking, well, then it just hurts them. If the state does a similar thing, spending money in the short term, thinking, yes, this will go great, I'm going to enjoy this, or I'm going to win votes with this, but in the long term it hurts it isn't just going to be the state that is suffering, because the state is made up of individuals, and it oversees many more individuals, over 300 million in the case of the US, and well over 1 billion in the largest and most populous states on the planet. And so oftentimes, it is better to instead pursue a restraint, a control of fiscal resources in such a way to reduce that chance. In the case of debt, best to pay it off. Do not trust the state with debt, especially in elected government, because states will ignore the very real problems that come with large debts in favor of short-term gains. And they've done this over and over and over again. So essentially, you need the state restrained on that front. And when I say Spartan levels of possessions, I'm referring to limited levels of possessions. That's what Spartan means. For those who don't know, it was often a thing with the Spartans where they would have very limited amounts of possessions, especially for lower-class individuals. It was a big part of Spartan culture. But of course, with that came the elites who were separate from this and tended to have a lot more. Especially when it came to slaves, because, Sparta was a slave society. It was a very big aspect of their societal structure. But the big idea of Spartan restraint is still important because, the idea has been forever associated with them, even if it wasn't fully accurate. The idea of restraining one's possessions is a good one. You don't want too much. Even on this table of mine, I find myself often shuffling through way too many papers. And that's for school. For the average person, it can be even worse, and for the state, oh lord, that can be a problem. If the state has too much, it will often struggle managing so much, especially the case of corporations and other businesses, and so it will frequently become a tool of corruption. As such, for long-term prosperity, such things are almost certainly going to need to be dropped. This applies, importantly, to both the individual and to the state. Let's think about this as an individual. Investment, that is the key to a happy retirement. The ability to have money in the future that you can enjoy in the future by investing now is key to having an effective retirement. Sure, it may hurt in the short term. You may not be able to enjoy that trip to Italy or whatever you wanted to do, but it would allow for you to, say, take that trip later when you're an adult, and when you're older, and when you have a good financial reserve to have access to if needed. Similarly with possessions. You have too many possessions that you don't need, it's going to hurt, especially early on. For the state, it is even more so. Constant spending will naturally increase inflation because you're introducing more money into the economy. And having way too much stuff will lead to corruption, inefficiency, and just general wasted resources. So if you want prosperity, both for yourself and for the state, sacrifices are almost certainly going to be needed in the short term to allow for that prosperity of the future. To be allowing the indulgence that the state could have, or that you could have in the future, sacrifices will have to be made now. And of course, the whole paycheck to paycheck thing is a very real problem. Let's face it, our society is not the best right now when it comes to finances. But it is best to figure out what you can do yourself right now. What you can afford, how you can reduce it, getting your budget in order so you have less of a problem, because hey, sure, the state may not make everything affordable, nor will it ever really be able to outside of getting out the way. But even if you can't change that, you can at least change your own habits, make things a bit easier, a bit better, and use that leverage and compound it over and over until you have an advantage, until you are finally free and have the luxury of indulgence. Take advantage when you can. Long-term thinking isn't just true for the individual as a benefit, it is true for the state as well. And so when you cast your ballots, always remember that. And when you make your individual choices, remember that. The state is a reflection of the people in several ways, because it is ran by people. It affects people. And much like an individual must manage a budget, choose its decisions, and act accordingly. And so, whenever you think about what the state should do, always ask, would it be wise for an individual to do this? And if not, question how the state would be different. Or it can bring an individual much pain, but it can also lead to great rewards. So too can it do the same for the state. The same is true for managing a budget well, allowing liberties, while still restraining oneself via morality. Always remember that. And I do hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good day.